The term API is an abbreviation for Application Programming Interface and is basically a way for a web page to communicate with some other kind of computer system. The way an API actually works, the company will provide a service that you want to implement on your website. So they'll give you code to do that. Now, the small snippet of code, their API, is something that you will integrate into the code of your website. I know that sounds kind of weird, but when I give you some concrete examples, you'll understand it right away. So for engineers who build an API from scratch, an API is very difficult and complicated. But for developers like you and I, using an API should be simple. That is the whole point. An API integration is intended to be very easy. If it's really difficult, then it's a poorly written API. The whole point is that a company is providing a service to you as a customer. So their API code should be simple to understand, and you integrate their API into your website to enhance the capabilities of your website. Now, I have used many different API solutions over the years. For example, while building an order form on a website for a printing company, I used an API from UPS to calculate shipping charges. When building a website for a California motorcycle gathering site, I used an API from Google Maps to make a map displaying locations of the events. During my years working at a real estate investment company, I used an API to display MLS real estate properties for a real estate office in Colorado and for one in Los Angeles. And for this example, I will show you a simple API from Mailchimp used to add email addresses onto a mailing list. Now, I'm going to base it on the PHP order form that we used in the previous lesson and simply add the new code into the page. This is a good example of how to use an API because of the fact that the Mailchimp API is well done and it's very simplistic. And once we've already learned how to do a form like this, understanding how to do the Mailchimp additional stuff is pretty simple. So this is what the sample page looks like. And if we view the source code, you'll notice that it's pretty much exactly like the form that we've built before. But there's two subtle differences. One, there is an input type hidden, and the name of that field is campaign name and the value is newsletter. Now the reason for this is because Mailchimp always has a campaign name of some sort associated with your account. Okay? And you'll also notice that this field where you type in your name, on our previous example it was just name, now it's called full name. So let's look at the actual source code, and here we can see the full name, we can see the campaign name, and the send form email is a little bit different, but let's go back to that in a second. The other thing that is different is this folder right here that you see is called Mailchimp, and inside there is a file, mcapi.class, and this is basically all the instructions that Mailchimp is using. So if we look at this file, it's pretty complicated, but you don't need to do anything with this, okay? Like when you set up your account, this is just a file that they give you that you have to put somewhere on the server, but you don't really have to worry about what it's doing. But here, this is our send form email, and if I scroll down a bit, you can see from this point on down, this is everything that we have used before, okay? But there are two additional sections up here. There's start code to split names, and then there is start code to send a Mailchimp. Okay, so the first thing right here is this is changing the full name in our form into a first and last name. Okay, so if we come back in here, we can see this variable splitting the name is taking the post's full name from the form, and it's saying explode and you're inserting a space in between, and then you're creating two new variables of first name and last name so that that can be used in Mailchimp. And this next section that actually sends the code, you can see right here, it's calling that class file that I mentioned. And there are two things that you have to change. You have to change the API key, which is right here, and then you change the ID list. So the API key is basically like your account number for Mailchimp. And then the ID list, that is the number which is identified with the particular campaign name mailing list that you created. So very simple, because this is some extra stuff that I had to put in because of the nature of the names. But if you had a form that just called for a first name and last name, then you wouldn't need this part. And all you would have is just this, where you would just be changing that number, and that's all it would be. So pretty simple. I just wanted to get across the concept that a well-done API doesn't require a whole lot of work on your end for the programming. It's stuff that should be pretty simplistic. It's like you just drop in a file, you drop in a little bit of code, and maybe, change an account number, and that's it. And things should function well from that point on out. So the real lesson here is to go look at that additional code in the submission form and in the Mailchimp form that's all used in the zip file. So the Mailchimp form is really simple. There's literally just one PHP file that gets uploaded to the server, and a few additional lines of code get added to the web form processing page. And since you went through the previous lesson and learned how to get a PHP page to send an email, this lesson is really easy, because it's the identical code as the previous lesson with just a few extra lines added. So don't get intimidated when people ask if you have used an API, because there really isn't much to it. Companies that provide an API will typically have the process documented explicitly, and it will be very easy to implement. And remember, kids, the world owes you nothing until you create things of value.